January 17, 1944. 23,000 feet above the frost-covered fields of northern France, the sky belonged to those who could master it. Second Lieutenant Robert Madison, just 19 years old and barely 6 months out of flight training, gripped the controls of his Republic P-47 Thunderbolt as the morning sun pierced through scattered clouds. The young pilot from Philadelphia had logged exactly 47 hours of combat time, and he believed, with the certainty that only youth and inexperience can provide, that his extensive training had prepared him for anything the skies might throw at him. He was about to discover how profoundly wrong that assumption could be. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What unfolded in the next 18 minutes would transform a terrifying loss of control into one of the most unconventional aerial victories of the war, challenging every assumption about what defined mastery in the air and revealing that sometimes survival demands abandoning everything you think you know. The mission briefing at 0600 hours had seemed routine enough. Captain James Wheeler, their squadron operations officer, had outlined the objective with practiced efficiency: escort a formation of Boeing B-17 bombers returning from a raid deep into occupied territory. The intelligence report suggested minimal opposition. The German air forces in the region had been suffering from fuel shortages and were reportedly conserving their remaining aircraft for strategic defense. Madison had listened carefully, taking notes in the small leather journal his mother had given him before he shipped out, a habit that had earned him gentle ribbing from the other pilots who called him the Professor. Madison's journey to that briefing room had been anything but routine. Born in the Strawberry Mansion neighborhood of Philadelphia in 1924, he had grown up watching birds circle over the Schuylkill River, dreaming of flight, while navigating a world that insisted his skin color predetermined his limitations. When the Army Air Forces announced the formation of pursuit squadrons for colored pilots in 1941, Madison had been among the first in line at the recruitment office, his application completed in meticulous detail, despite the skeptical looks from the white recruiting officer who processed his paperwork. The path from that bedroom in Philadelphia to the cockpit of a Thunderbolt over France had been neither straight nor easy. When Robert had announced his intention to apply for the aviation program in early 1942, his parents had supported him despite their private fears. They understood the statistics. Training was deliberately difficult, washout rates were high, and even successful graduates faced a military establishment that questioned whether colored men could perform as equals to white pilots. The training at Tuskegee Army Airfield in Alabama had been deliberately punishing. Colonel Frederick Kimball, the base commander, had made no secret of his belief that the experimental program would fail, stating openly that colored pilots lacked the mental capacity for the split-second decisions required in aerial combat. The statement had appeared in the base newspaper, and Madison had cut it out and kept it in his journal, a reminder of what he was fighting against. Madison had responded by graduating third in his class of 42 pilots, mastering navigation, gunnery, and aerobatics with a quiet determination that impressed even his harshest critics. His instructors noted in their evaluations that he possessed unusual spatial awareness and an intuitive understanding of aircraft systems that went beyond mere memorization of procedures. One instructor, Captain Arnold Bennett, wrote in Madison's file, "This cadet demonstrates exceptional aptitude for understanding cause and effect relationships in aircraft performance. He asks questions that suggest deep systematic thinking rather than rote learning." The training had been comprehensive, but combat reality would prove different from classroom exercises. Madison's real education began when his squadron deployed to England 5 months earlier. His first combat mission had occurred on August 23, 1943. Madison remembered every detail: the cold breakfast that sat uneasy in his stomach, the precise weight of his flight gear, the smell of aviation fuel and oil that permeated the aircraft. He had been assigned as wingman to Captain Robert Hayes, a veteran with 11 confirmed victories who had taken Madison under his wing despite the racial attitudes that still permeated even the integrated squadrons. Hayes had been a revelation. Unlike many of the white officers who viewed the colored pilots with skepticism or outright hostility, Hayes judged men solely on their performance in the air. He had grown up on a farm in Iowa, the son of immigrants who had fled poverty in Ireland, and he possessed a practical wisdom that cut through the ideological prejudices of the era. During their first pre-flight briefing, Hayes had told Madison, "I don't care what color you are, up there. The only color that matters is the color of the aircraft trying to get a firing solution on you. Watch my 6, I'll watch yours, and we'll both make it home." That first mission had been a bomber escort to Schweinfurt, deep into German territory. Madison had been terrified, though he hid it behind a mask of professional competence, the sight of anti-aircraft fire blooming like deadly flowers in the sky, the way the bomber formation tightened when German fighters appeared, the sudden violence of air combat where one moment you were flying in formation and the next moment aircraft were tumbling from the sky trailing smoke. All of it had been overwhelming. Madison hadn't fired his guns that day. The engagement had been brief and confusing, and by the time he had maneuvered into position to shoot, the German fighters had broken off and disappeared into clouds. Hayes had reassured him afterward that his performance had been good, that he had maintained formation discipline and kept his situational awareness when many first-timers became fixated on threats and lost track of their wingman. But Madison had felt inadequate, convinced he had failed some essential test. The subsequent missions had gradually built his confidence and competence. He learned to read the sky, to spot the telltale glint of sunlight on a canopy that revealed an enemy fighter before it became a threat. He learned to manage the fear that never entirely disappeared, but could be channeled into heightened alertness rather than paralysis. He learned the subtle art of formation flying, maintaining position through turns and altitude changes without requiring constant attention that would have left him vulnerable to surprise. By January 1944, Madison had flown 63 combat missions and accumulated those 47 hours of combat time. He had scored his first victory 3 weeks earlier, a Messerschmitt Bf-109 that he had caught in a climbing turn, leading his target perfectly and walking his tracers into the enemy aircraft's fuselage until smoke began pouring from its engine. The German pilot had bailed out, his parachute deploying successfully, and Madison had felt a complex mix of pride in his marksmanship and relief that he hadn't taken a life, at least not directly. Now, 5 months into his combat deployment with the 332nd Fighter Group, Madison had developed a reputation for precision flying and an almost obsessive attention to mechanical details. While other pilots would head to the officers' club after debriefing, Madison could usually be found in the maintenance hangar, discussing engine performance with Master Sergeant Thomas Burke, a gruff Texan who had initially refused to speak to the colored pilots, but had gradually developed a grudging respect for Madison's technical knowledge. Burke had grown up during an era when segregation was simply accepted as natural law, and his initial hostility toward the colored pilots had been more reflexive than considered. But Burke was, above all else, a professional who respected expertise, and Madison's questions about engine timing, propeller pitch, and fuel mixture demonstrated a depth of understanding that Burke had rarely encountered even among white pilots. Their conversations, initially terse and reluctant, had gradually evolved into genuine technical discussions where Madison's insights often proved valuable. The morning of January 17th began with mechanical concerns that, in retrospect, seemed almost prophetic. During pre-flight inspection, Madison had noticed a slight vibration in the control column that hadn't been present during his previous sortie. It was subtle, barely perceptible, the kind of thing that less attentive pilots might have missed entirely or dismissed as insignificant. But Madison had learned to trust his hands, to pay attention to the small deviations that sometimes heralded larger problems. He mentioned it to Sergeant Burke, who checked the control cables with his characteristic thoroughness. Burke had inspected the attachment points, examined the cables for fraying, checked the tension and found nothing obvious. The vibration could have been caused by any number of minor issues: slightly uneven tire wear, a loose access panel creating turbulence, minor imbalance in the propeller, none of which would significantly affect flight operations. Burke had looked Madison in the eye with an expression that combined professional assessment with something approaching paternal concern. "Madison," said Burke, "she's good to fly, Lieutenant. But you've got good instincts. Keep them sharp up there." Those words would echo in Madison's mind during the hours to come, a reminder that intuition and technical knowledge were both essential tools for survival. The takeoff at 07:15 proceeded smoothly. Madison's Thunderbolt, tail number 23789, with the distinctive red tail markings of his squadron, lifted off from the steel mat runway with the characteristic rumble of its massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine. The aircraft weighed 7 tons fully loaded, carried 8 .50 caliber machine guns, and could theoretically reach 428 miles per hour in level flight, though Madison had never pushed his particular aircraft past 380 miles per hour, preferring to maintain a safety margin that some of the more aggressive pilots considered overcautious. Madison's conservative approach to aircraft operations stemmed partly from his engineering mindset and partly from practical wisdom. Every mechanical system had design limits, but those limits represented the point of catastrophic failure, not the point of optimal operation. Running an engine at maximum power might provide a temporary advantage, but it also increased wear, raised the probability of mechanical failure, and reduced the margin for error if something went wrong. Madison preferred to operate his aircraft at 80 or 85% of its maximum capability, accepting slightly reduced performance in exchange for significantly improved reliability. This philosophy had earned him teasing from some of the squadron's more aggressive pilots, who called him Gentle Robert and joked about his grandmother-like flying style. But it had also resulted in a perfect maintenance record. In 63 previous missions, Madison had never experienced a mechanical failure significant enough to abort a mission or require an emergency landing. His aircraft always brought him home, and in a war where mechanical reliability could be as important as piloting skill, that record spoke for itself. The flight to the rendezvous point took 37 minutes. Madison flew as number 3 in a 4-ship formation led by Captain Hayes, maintaining position with the unconscious precision that came from hours of practice. The formation consisted of Hayes in the lead, Lieutenant Marcus Williams on his wing, Madison in the number 3 position, and Lieutenant David Thompson flying as Madison's wingman. They climbed steadily, watching the patchwork English countryside fall away beneath them as they gained altitude and headed east toward France. The morning air was cold and clear, visibility extending for dozens of miles in every direction. At 20,000 feet, Madison could see the English Channel ahead, its waters grey and choppy under scattered clouds. The temperature inside the cockpit hovered just above freezing despite the inefficient heater, and Madison could see his breath condensing in small clouds when he exhaled. His hands, even inside their leather gloves, were starting to stiffen from the cold, and he flexed his fingers periodically to maintain dexterity. They crossed the French coast at 22,000 feet, the beaches and cliffs that marked the transition from sea to land clearly visible in the morning light. Anti-aircraft fire began almost immediately, black puffs of smoke appearing in their vicinity as German gunners tried to estimate their altitude and heading. The fire was light and inaccurate, the gunners more interested in harassing the formation than seriously attempting to engage, and Hayes led them through a series of gentle turns that made their track unpredictable without breaking formation integrity. Madison had learned not to fixate on the anti-aircraft fire. It was terrifying the first few times, seeing explosions bloom in the sky nearby, knowing that each burst represented thousands of metal fragments moving at lethal velocities through the space his aircraft might occupy. But statistics and experience had taught him that anti-aircraft fire was more psychological weapon than practical threat. The sky was vast, aircraft were small and fast-moving, and hitting one with an unguided explosive shell required extraordinary luck on the gunner's part or extraordinary misfortune on the pilot's. They met the bomber formation at 22,000 feet over a cloud layer that looked like an endless cotton field stretching to every horizon. 16 B-17s, flying in tight box formation, their aluminum skin gleaming in the winter sun. Each bomber carried a crew of 10 men who had just survived hours over heavily defended territory, and the fighter pilot's job was to ensure they made it home to their base in England. Madison could see battle damage on several of the bombers, holes in wings and fuselages. One bomber with its number 3 engine feathered and motionless, another trailing a thin stream of vapor that might have been fuel or hydraulic fluid. The bomber crews must have been exhausted. They had been in the air for 8 or 9 hours, much of that time over hostile territory where any moment might bring attacking fighters or concentrated anti-aircraft fire. The physical demands of flying a heavy bomber in formation were punishing. Constant attention to altitude, airspeed and position, hands and feet working the controls for hours without respite. The mental demands were worse. The knowledge that German fighters might appear at any moment, that anti-aircraft fire could shred the aircraft and everyone in it without warning, that mechanical failure this far from home meant almost certain capture or worse. Madison's squadron took up position above and behind the bomber formation, executing the weave pattern that allowed the faster fighters to stay with the slower bombers without overrunning them. The weave involved flying a gentle S pattern, crossing back and forth above the bomber stream while scanning the sky for threats. It required constant attention and smooth control inputs, maintaining enough speed to be able to respond quickly to threats while not accelerating so much that you left your assigned position. For the first 40 minutes, nothing happened. The formation droned westward, the steady rhythm of engines creating a cocoon of sound that could lull even experienced pilots into complacency. Madison performed his assigned weave pattern, scanning the sky in systematic sectors, checking his instruments periodically, managing his fuel consumption to ensure he would have sufficient reserves to make it back to England. The routine nature of the flight created its own danger, the temptation to relax, to let attention wander, to assume that because nothing had happened for 40 minutes, nothing would happen. Hayes had taught Madison to fight this complacency through disciplined routine. Every 2 minutes, Madison would execute a complete visual scan, check 6 o'clock for threats from behind, scan above and below, check instrument readings, verify formation position, check fuel state, return to visual scanning. The routine became almost meditative, a structured pattern that kept his mind engaged and prevented the dangerous drift into inattention. At 0912, everything changed. The attack came from above and behind, a tactic the German pilots had refined over years of combat. 6 Focke-Wulf 190 fighters, their radial engines screaming as they dove from 28,000 feet, targeted the bomber formation with practiced precision. The German pilots had positioned themselves perfectly, using the sun to mask their approach, waiting until the American fighters were at the far end of their weave pattern before initiating their attack. The radio erupted with warnings and position calls as the American fighters broke formation to engage. Hayes's voice cut through the chaos with practiced calm, assigning targets and coordinating the squadron's response. Madison acknowledged his assigned sector and began the transition from escort weave to combat maneuvering, his body responding with the trained automaticity that allowed conscious thought to focus on tactics while muscle memory handled aircraft control. Madison's training took over. He pushed the throttle forward, feeling the Thunderbolt's engine respond with a surge of power that pressed him back into his seat. The engine note changed, rising in pitch as the propeller bit into the thin air and translated increased power into increased speed. He rolled right, pulling into a climbing turn to intercept one of the attackers who was lining up on a straggling bomber. The G-forces compressed his body, narrowing his vision to a tunnel focused on the enemy aircraft, injuries draining from his head toward his legs and threatening to gray out his vision. Madison tensed his leg and abdominal muscles, using the technique he had learned in training to retain some of the trapped injuries and maintain consciousness during the high G turn. The physical strain was immense. It felt like an invisible weight was pressing down on his entire body, making every movement require twice the normal effort. His breathing came in short gasps as his chest muscles fought against the G-forces, and he could feel the beginning of tunnel vision creeping in from the edges of his sight. The Focke-Wulf grew larger in his windscreen as he closed the distance, his aircraft's superior dive performance allowing him to gain on the German fighter despite its head start. Madison positioned his sight reticle ahead of the enemy aircraft, leading the target to account for the relative motion between the two planes. His thumb moved toward the firing button on his control stick, preparing for the moment when geometry and timing would align to create a valid firing solution. That's when the control column locked, not gradually, not with warning. One moment Madison had full control of his aircraft, and the next, the stick was rigid in his hands, immovable as if welded in place. The Thunderbolt, caught in a 60-degree bank with the stick pulled back, began a tightening spiral that increased in violence with each revolution. The nose dropped below the horizon, and the aircraft began rotating around its longitudinal axis, entering what pilots called a graveyard spiral, a type of loss of control that had ended countless flights and countless lives. Madison's first reaction was disbelief. This wasn't supposed to happen. The Thunderbolt was legendary for its robust construction, for taking punishment that would destroy lighter fighters. Republic Aviation had designed the aircraft with redundancy and strength as primary considerations, building it around a massive radial engine and using construction techniques that prioritized durability over weight savings. But here he was, 19 years old and 19,000 feet above occupied France, trapped in an aircraft that was rapidly becoming his coffin. The spiral tightened. 4 G-forces pressed Madison into his seat, then 5, then 6. His vision narrowed further as pressure drained from his brain toward his lower body. The standard procedure was clear. If you cannot regain control, bail out. But something in Madison refused to abandon his aircraft. Perhaps it was stubbornness. Perhaps it was the knowledge that a colored pilot who lost an aircraft would face questions that white pilots might avoid. Perhaps it was simply the visceral terror of stepping into empty space with nothing but a silk parachute between him and the earth. He fought the controls with every ounce of strength, trying to force the stick forward, sideways, any direction that might break the spiral. His arms trembled with effort as he pulled and pushed against the immovable column, knowing even as he did so that mechanical advantage worked against him. If a control cable had broken or jammed, no amount of human strength would overcome the aerodynamic forces holding the control surfaces in position. Nothing moved. The altimeter unwound with terrifying speed. 18,000 feet, 17,000, 16,000. At this rate, he had perhaps 90 seconds before the spiral would tighten beyond any hope of recovery, the aircraft breaking apart from structural stress or simply auguring into the frozen French farmland below. Madison's mind raced through possibilities. The rudder pedal still had some movement, but rudder alone couldn't break the spiral. It could only make it worse or change its character. The throttle was functional, but reducing power wouldn't address the fundamental problem of locked flight controls. The trim tabs, small auxiliary control surfaces designed to relieve control pressure during extended flight, represented the only possibility he could think of. Then Madison remembered something Sergeant Burke had mentioned during one of their hangar conversations 3 months earlier. They had been discussing control system design, and Burke had mentioned that the Thunderbolt's trim tab mechanism was unusually powerful, designed to allow the aircraft to be flown hands-off during long ferry flights. Burke had actually said, half joking, that in theory you could probably fly the whole aircraft on trim alone, though nobody would ever want to try it, because the response would be so slow and imprecise. The trim wheel was located on the left side of the cockpit, a small handwheel that pilots used for minor adjustments during level flight. Madison had never heard of anyone using it as a primary flight control, but he had exactly no other options. His left hand left the throttle and seized the trim wheel. He cranked it forward with desperate strength, full forward travel, feeling the mechanism resist and then suddenly move freely as it reached the limits of its adjustment range. For 2 or 3 seconds, nothing happened. The spiral continued, tightening, the aircraft shuddering as it approached its structural limits. Madison could hear creaking sounds from the airframe, metal flexing under loads it was never designed to sustain for more than brief moments. 14,000 feet. 13,000. He was going to perish. The thought was crystal clear and strangely calm, his mind already beginning to accept what seemed inevitable. Then, with a violence that slammed Madison's helmet against the canopy, the Thunderbolt's nose pitched forward. The trim tab's control authority, minimal during normal flight, had been amplified by the high-speed airflow rushing past the control surfaces. The sudden change in direction broke the spiral, but it threw the aircraft into a dive that was, if anything, more dangerous than the spiral had been. Madison was now pointed almost straight down, accelerating through 400 miles per hour and approaching the speed where control surfaces would become ineffective and structural failure inevitable. The physical sensations were overwhelming. Madison's body was thrown against his restraining harness as the aircraft's motion changed from rotational to linear. His stomach seemed to float upward as the rapid descent reduced the apparent pull of gravity. The engine noise changed, the propeller windmilling now rather than being driven by the engine, creating a distinctive howling sound that Madison had never heard before. The airspeed indicator needle was moving past markings he had never seen it approach, into the red arc that indicated speeds where the aircraft might simply come apart from aerodynamic forces. He cranked the trim wheel back, trying to arrest the dive without putting too much stress on the airframe. The Thunderbolt responded sluggishly, its nose coming up in fractional increments that seemed agonizingly slow. 10,000 feet. 9,000. The fields below were no longer abstract patterns, but individual farms, bare trees, a road with what might have been a truck crawling along it. Madison could make out individual buildings, hedgerows dividing frozen fields, a small village clustered around a church steeple. At 7,000 feet, the aircraft finally returned to something approaching level flight. Madison's hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the trim wheel steady. His flight suit was soaked with sweat despite the bitter cold at altitude, the fabric sticking to his skin uncomfortably. His heart was hammering in his chest, adrenaline flooding his system with a cocktail of chemicals designed for fight-or-flight responses that had no productive outlet in this situation. He had survived, but he was far from safe. The control column remained locked. The rudder pedals had some movement, and the trim wheel gave him crude control over pitch and roll, but flying the aircraft was like trying to perform surgery while wearing boxing gloves. Every adjustment was an approximation, every turn a calculated gamble. The trim wheel's response was delayed by several seconds, requiring Madison to plan his maneuvers well in advance and accept that the aircraft's actual flight path would only approximately match his intentions. Madison's radio had been squawking throughout the ordeal, voices demanding his position, his status, whether he was hit. He managed to key the microphone, his voice sounding strange and distant to his own ears, and report that he had control problems but was remaining airborne. Captain Hayes's voice came back immediately, cutting through the background chatter with clarity born of command authority. "Madison," Hayes said, "head west. We'll cover your withdrawal. If you can't maintain control, punch out." That's an order. But something unexpected happened in the next few seconds. Madison, wrestling with his crippled aircraft at 7,000 feet, spotted movement below him through a gap in the scattered clouds. Two of the German fighters had broken off from the main engagement and were circling back, apparently having spotted his distress and his loss of altitude. They were below him, perhaps 2,000 feet lower, apparently assuming he was finished and would present an easy target once they climbed back to his altitude. Standard tactics said Madison should run. His aircraft was crippled, his control authority minimal, and he was alone and isolated from the rest of his squadron. Engaging enemy fighters under these circumstances wasn't brave. It was self-destructive. Every instinct, every hour of training, every briefing on survival tactics said his only rational choice was to use whatever control he had to head west and hope he could stay ahead of pursuers until friendly fighters or anti-aircraft defenses could protect him. But Madison had spent 19 years being told what he couldn't do, what his limitations were, what choices were available to people who looked like him. And in this moment, flying a broken aircraft thousands of feet above enemy territory, with German fighters moving into position to finish him, something in him simply refused to accept the script he was supposed to follow. He couldn't run effectively. The crippled controls made evasive maneuvering nearly impossible, but he could fall, and the Thunderbolt was very, very good at falling. What happened next would be debated in after-action reports and argued about in officers' clubs for months afterward. Madison, flying an aircraft that barely responded to control inputs, initiated an attack. It was insane by any conventional standard. Fighter tactics depended on precise maneuvering, on putting your guns on target while keeping the enemy off yours. Madison had neither precision nor conventional control, but what he did have was gravity, the Thunderbolt's massive weight, and 850 caliber machine guns that would work just fine regardless of how his aircraft was being controlled. The laws of physics didn't care whether you were flying smoothly or desperately. He cranked the trim wheel forward again, dropping the nose toward the two German fighters. The Thunderbolt accelerated in the dive, quickly passing 450 miles per hour, faster than Madison had ever flown, the airframe beginning to vibrate in ways that suggested he was approaching limits that should not be approached. The two enemy aircraft, apparently surprised that the crippled American fighter was attacking rather than fleeing, broke formation, one going left and one right, in a classic defensive split that should have forced any pursuing fighter to choose one target and allow the other to escape. Madison had no hope of following either turn. His aircraft wasn't capable of the rapid maneuver required to stay with either German fighter through their evasive brakes. Instead, he adjusted his dive angle with tiny movements of the trim wheel, pointing his aircraft like an arrow at the space where the left-turning fighter would be if Madison had calculated the geometry correctly. It was less flying than calculated falling, using potential energy instead of aerodynamic control, gambling that mathematics and luck would align for just long enough to create a firing opportunity. The German pilot, a veteran named Wilhelm Koenig, with 14 victories to his credit, would later report to his commanding officer that he had never seen such a bizarre attack profile. The American fighter simply dropped toward him like a brick, making no attempt at conventional maneuvering, carrying so much speed that it should have been impossible to control. Koenig tried to dive away, attempting to use his aircraft's superior maneuverability to escape the falling American fighter, but the geometry was against him. Madison's aircraft was already accelerating downward faster than the German fighter could match. For perhaps 2 seconds, the two aircraft were on converging courses, their relative positions changing with mathematical inevitability. Madison held down the trigger on his control stick, feeling the thunderbolt shudder as all 8 guns fired in unison, each gun cycling at 800 rounds per minute, creating a stream of 50 caliber bullets that filled the air ahead of him with lethal metal. The recoil from 8 heavy machine guns was substantial, even for an aircraft as massive as the Thunderbolt, creating vibrations that Madison could feel through his entire body. The nose wanted to rise slightly from the recoil force, requiring constant adjustment of the trim wheel to maintain his aim point. Brass shell casings, ejected from the guns, streamed past the cockpit, glinting in the sunlight before tumbling away into the slipstream. The guns created a distinctive smell, hot metal and propellant gases that seeped into the cockpit despite the sealed canopy. He saw his tracers converge on the enemy fighter, every 5th round a tracer that left a visible streak in the air, allowing him to see where his bullets were going. The stream of fire walked across the German aircraft's left wing, stitching a line of impacts that were visible even from Madison's rapidly changing position. Pieces of the aircraft's left wing separated, tumbling away in the slipstream. Smoke began trailing from the engine cowling, a dark plume that grew larger with each passing second. Koenig felt his aircraft shudder under the impacts, heard the distinctive sound of bullets punching through aluminum, and experiencing the gut-wrenching sensation of his fighter suddenly becoming less responsive to control inputs. His engine temperature gauge began rising rapidly, indicating damage to the cooling system or the engine itself. He rolled inverted and dove away, his aircraft clearly damaged but still controllable, heading east toward German-held territory where he might be able to nurse the wounded fighter back to his base. Madison tried to pull out of his own dive, but the trim wheel response was too slow. He passed through 4,000 feet, 3,000, 2,000, the ground rushing up with terrifying speed. At 1,500 feet, the nose finally came up, and the Thunderbolt leveled off barely 500 feet above the frozen fields, so low that Madison could see individual fence posts and a farmer who had stopped his work to stare up at the thundering aircraft. The airspeed indicator showed 240 miles per hour, still dangerously fast for such low altitude, but at least below the speed where control authority became problematic. Madison was breathing in ragged gasps, his entire body trembling from adrenaline and the physical strain of the engagement. He had just performed what should have been impossible, engaging an enemy fighter while flying a crippled aircraft, and somehow he had not only survived, but actually landed hits. His radio erupted with voices. Hayes was shouting for a status report, his usual calm replaced by genuine concern. Someone else was calling out positions of the remaining German fighters, who had broken off the engagement and were withdrawing eastward. The bomber formation was continuing west, intact except for one B-17, that was trailing smoke, but still maintaining formation, and Madison could hear the bomber pilots offering words of encouragement and disbelief at what they had just witnessed. Madison tried to respond, but his voice wouldn't work. His throat felt constricted, his breath coming in short gasps that left no air for speech. He swallowed, tried again, managed to croak out that he was alive and heading west. His airspeed had dropped to 210 miles per hour, and he was burning fuel at an alarming rate after the high-power dive. But the Thunderbolt was still flying, still responding to the clumsy inputs he could provide through the trim wheel. Hayes and Lieutenant Williams, another pilot from the squadron, formed up on Madison's wings, escorting him home. Hayes would later say that watching Madison fly that crippled aircraft was like watching a master juggler perform with one hand tied behind his back, technically impossible, but somehow happening anyway. Williams kept up a steady stream of position calls and encouragement over the radio, providing the kind of emotional support that didn't appear in any training manual but was essential nonetheless. The flight back to base took 97 minutes, the longest of Madison's life. He maintained low altitude, barely 1,000 feet, using the trim wheel to make gentle adjustments while avoiding anything that might stress the frozen control system. Every few minutes, he would test the control column, hoping that whatever had jammed it might free itself, that the vibrations of flight might shake something loose, or that thermal expansion might change clearances enough to restore movement. It never did. The stick remained rigid, immovable, a constant reminder of his aircraft's crippled state. Flying at low altitude created its own challenges. The margin for error was minimal. Any sudden control loss or mechanical failure would leave him no room to recover. The terrain below was a mix of farms, forests, and occasional small towns, any of which could spell disaster if he had to make an emergency landing. The weather remained clear, which was fortunate, because flying through clouds or precipitation with such limited control authority would have been nearly impossible. Madison found himself settling into a strange calm as the minutes passed. The initial terror had faded, replaced by a kind of focused determination. The task was clear: keep the aircraft level, maintain heading, manage fuel consumption, stay alert for any changes in the aircraft's behavior. It was almost meditative, this intense concentration on the immediate present, pushing aside thoughts of what might happen if something else went wrong. Crossing back over the English Channel was an emotional moment. The cold grey water below represented a boundary between occupied territory and relative safety. If he had to bail out now, the chances of rescue were much better than they had been over France. The British Rescue Service operated high-speed launches that patrolled the channel, picking up downed airmen from both sides. The water was cold enough that survival time would be measured in minutes rather than hours, but at least there was hope. England appeared ahead, the white cliffs of Dover emerging from the haze, a sight that never failed to evoke emotion in pilots returning from combat. Madison felt tears in his eyes, though whether they were from relief or exhaustion or simply the strain of the past hour he couldn't say. His hands ached from gripping the trim wheel, his shoulders and back were tight from muscle tension, and he suddenly became aware of just how exhausted he was. The landing approach to their base in southern England required descending through a cloud layer and executing a turn to line up with the runway. For a pilot with a jammed control stick, it should have been impossible. Madison used every trick he could devise, adjusting power to control descent rate, using the trim wheel in tiny increments to establish a gentle descending turn, trusting his instincts and his minimal instruments to guide him when visual references disappeared into the clouds. The transition into the cloud layer was disorienting. One moment he could see the ground below and the horizon ahead. The next moment he was in grey nothing, all visual references gone, forced to rely entirely on his instruments to maintain aircraft orientation. The artificial horizon showed him his bank angle and pitch. The altimeter showed his descent rate. The compass showed his heading. But reading instruments and making the tiny trim wheel adjustments necessary to maintain controlled flight required every bit of his concentration. He broke out of the clouds at 800 feet, slightly left of the runway centerline. A normal pilot would have applied right rudder and aileron to correct, executing a smooth turn to align with the runway while maintaining proper glide slope. Madison cranked the trim wheel right, felt the aircraft begin a sluggish roll to the right, added left rudder to prevent the roll from becoming too steep, reduced power to maintain descent rate. It was like flying in slow motion. Every input delayed and approximate, requiring constant mental calculation to predict where the aircraft would be several seconds in the future. The runway rushed up beneath him. Madison cut the power, held the trim wheel steady, and felt the main wheels touch down with a thump that was simultaneously the most terrifying and most welcome sensation of his life. The Thunderbolt rolled down the runway, slowing gradually, still controllable through differential braking and rudder. When it finally stopped, Madison sat in the cockpit for a long moment, his hands still gripping the controls, unable to quite believe he was on the ground. The maintenance crew that swarmed over the aircraft discovered that a control cable had broken inside the wing root, a failure so rare that many of the experienced mechanics had never seen it happen. The cable had failed in a way that jammed the stick in position rather than simply going slack, which was the more common failure mode. The break had occurred at a point where the cable passed through a pulley, and the frayed end had become wedged in the pulley housing, creating the jam that left Madison with no control authority. Sergeant Burke examined the broken cable and the flight control logs, then looked at Madison with an expression that mixed respect with something approaching awe. "Lieutenant," Burke said slowly, "I've been working on aircraft for 16 years. I have never heard of anyone flying a fighter back to base with a broken control cable. Not once, not ever. I need you to understand how impossible what you just did actually was." The intelligence officer who debriefed Madison spent 2 hours going over the flight, trying to understand exactly what had happened during the engagement. When Madison described his attack on the German fighter, using the dive and trim control to create a firing solution, the intelligence officer initially thought he was either joking or in shock. Only when Captain Hayes and Lieutenant Williams corroborated the account, and when gun camera footage showed the German fighter taking hits and trailing smoke, did the intelligence officer accept that what should have been impossible had actually occurred. The gun camera footage was reviewed repeatedly by squadron intelligence officers and tactics instructors who struggled to categorize what they were seeing. The attack violated every principle of fighter combat they understood, yet it had succeeded. Madison's aircraft in the footage appeared barely controlled, dropping more than flying, yet his fire had been accurate enough to damage an enemy fighter. The incident challenged assumptions about what defined effective fighter tactics. The damage assessment report on Madison's aircraft ran to 3 pages. In addition to the broken control cable, the airframe had been stressed beyond normal limits during the spiral and subsequent dive. Multiple rivets had sheared, several panels showed buckling, and the engine had been oversped by nearly 200 revolutions per minute, beyond its rated maximum. The aircraft was declared unfit for flight and was eventually stripped for parts, its service record ending with a notation that it had been flown home despite catastrophic control failure. But Madison's combat record showed something unprecedented. 1 enemy aircraft damaged while flying a crippled fighter with no conventional control authority. The engagement was classified as a probable victory rather than a confirmed one, since the German fighter had managed to withdraw rather than being completely defeated. But the very fact that Madison had engaged rather than simply attempting to survive was remarkable enough that the squadron commander submitted him for a Distinguished Flying Cross. The award citation, when it came through 6 weeks later, was carefully worded. It mentioned courage and exceptional airmanship, but avoided specific details about the control failure, probably because acknowledging that a pilot had continued combat operations with a jammed control stick might encourage other pilots to take similar risks that could end less fortunately. Madison didn't care about the wording. He kept the citation in the same leather journal his mother had given him, on the page after his notes from that morning's briefing, a permanent record of the day he learned what was possible when impossibility was the only option. What Madison learned that day fundamentally changed how he approached flying and life itself. The incident revealed something that his training had never quite communicated, that sometimes survival and success require abandoning the approved procedures and inventing solutions in real time, using whatever tools remain available. The trim wheel was never intended as a primary flight control, but when it was the only option available, it became exactly what he needed it to be. The attack on the German fighter violated every principle of fighter tactics he had been taught, but by accepting that conventional maneuvering was impossible and instead using the aircraft's weight and momentum, he had created an opportunity that shouldn't have existed according to any manual or training syllabus. Over the next 11 months, Madison flew 73 additional combat missions, amassing a record that included 3 confirmed victories and 5 probables. He survived being shot down once over Belgium, managing to evade capture for 6 days with the help of resistance members before making contact with Allied forces. He crash-landed twice more due to mechanical problems, each time bringing his aircraft down with minimal damage despite difficult circumstances. He brought damaged aircraft back to base on 4 separate occasions beyond the January incident, developing a reputation for being able to nurse wounded fighters home when other pilots might have bailed out. His squadron mates began calling him steady because of his unflappable demeanor under pressure and his reputation for bringing broken aircraft home when others considered the situation hopeless. The nickname stuck, following him through the rest of his military career and into his civilian life afterward. It represented not just his flying skill, but his entire approach to challenges. Methodical, calm, refusing to panic even when circumstances seemed overwhelming. The broader impact of Madison's achievement on January 17th extended in multiple directions. For his squadron, it became a teaching moment about creative problem-solving under pressure. Hayes would often reference the incident during briefings when discussing emergency procedures, emphasizing that while standard procedures should always be the first response, pilots needed to be prepared to think beyond the manual when circumstances demanded it. The incident was written up as a case study for the Army Air Force's Training Command, though the details were sanitized to avoid encouraging reckless behavior. For Madison personally, the experience fundamentally reshaped his understanding of what was possible. Before that day, he had been a capable but conventional pilot, following procedures and relying on his training to guide his decisions. After surviving what should have been unsurvivable, he approached flying with a different mindset, one that recognized that aircraft and procedures were tools to be used creatively rather than rigid frameworks that constrained possibility. This shift in thinking would prove invaluable in his post-war career and in situations far removed from military aviation. The psychological impact of the experience took longer to fully process. In the immediate aftermath, Madison functioned on adrenaline and the demands of continued combat operations. He flew another mission just 3 days after the incident, assigned to a replacement aircraft that felt subtly different from his previous fighter. Every time he took off during those first weeks, he found himself hyper-aware of the control column, testing it periodically to ensure it was moving freely, alert for any vibration or resistance that might herald another failure. The nightmares began about 2 weeks after the incident. Madison would wake in his quarters, heart racing, reliving the moment when the control column locked and the spiral began. Sometimes the dreams would alter the outcome, showing him variations where he didn't think of the trim wheel, where the aircraft broke apart during the dive, where he failed to land successfully. He mentioned these dreams to no one, recognizing that admitting to psychological stress could result in being grounded or sent for psychiatric evaluation that might end his flying career. Lieutenant Williams, Madison's wingman and closest friend in the squadron, seemed to sense the struggle without being told. Williams had grown up in Chicago, the son of a doctor who had fought his own battles for professional recognition in a medical establishment that questioned whether colored physicians could match white practitioners' capabilities. Williams understood the additional pressure Madison faced, the knowledge that any sign of weakness would be magnified, used as evidence to support racist assumptions about colored pilots' fitness for combat. One evening, about 3 weeks after the incident, Williams sat down next to Madison in the officers' club and said simply, "You know it wasn't your fault, right? The cable breaking, I mean. You couldn't have prevented it." Madison had looked at his friend, surprised by the directness of the comment, and realized that Williams understood more than he had revealed. They talked for 2 hours that night, not just about the incident, but about the broader burden of representation they both carried, the exhausting necessity of being exceptional rather than merely competent. That conversation helped Madison process the experience in healthier ways. He began keeping more detailed notes in his leather journal, not just about technical flying matters, but about his thoughts and emotions, using writing as a form of therapy before anyone would have used that term. He wrote about his fears, his doubts, his pride in what he had accomplished, his anger at the racial injustices he confronted daily, his determination to prove through excellence that the racist assumptions were false. The journal became a kind of anchor, a way to organize his thoughts and maintain perspective during the chaos of combat operations. The broader historical significance of Madison's achievement extended beyond aviation. As one of the early colored combat pilots, in an era when military integration was still controversial and incomplete, his record of bringing damaged aircraft home despite impossible odds provided concrete evidence against the persistent racist assumptions that questioned whether colored pilots possessed the intelligence and composure for demanding military roles. Every successful mission, every impossible landing, every damaged aircraft nursed back to base became a data point in a larger argument about human capability and the artificiality of racial hierarchies. The statistics told a compelling story. By the end of the war, colored pilots in Madison's squadron had achieved combat records that matched or exceeded those of white squadrons flying similar missions. They had fewer losses per mission, higher rates of successful emergency landings following combat damage, and equivalent or better gunnery scores. These outcomes directly contradicted the predictions of those who had opposed the colored pilot program, and they provided empirical evidence that skill and courage had nothing to do with skin color. Madison himself was remarkably modest about this aspect of his service. When asked in later years about his role in advancing racial integration in the military, he would typically deflect the question, saying he was simply trying to do his job and survive the war. But those who served with him recognized the additional burden he carried, the knowledge that his failures would be attributed to his race, while his successes would be dismissed as exceptions, the constant pressure to be not just good, but exceptional, to never provide ammunition to those who wanted the integration experiment to fail. The fact that his extraordinary feat of airmanship on January 17th happened while flying a crippled aircraft added another layer to the historical significance. It wasn't enough to be competent or even skilled. Madison had to demonstrate capability that exceeded what was expected of white pilots, achieving success in circumstances where failure would have been completely understandable and easily dismissed as simple bad luck. The unfairness of this standard was obvious to everyone involved, but it remained the reality until years of accumulated evidence from Madison and hundreds of other colored pilots gradually eroded the racist assumptions that had justified segregation. Sergeant Burke, the maintenance chief who had initially refused to speak to the colored pilots, became one of Madison's strongest advocates after the January 17th incident. Burke's transformation was gradual but genuine. He began seeking Madison's input on mechanical issues, recognizing that Madison's understanding of aircraft systems sometimes revealed problems that might otherwise have been missed. He started defending the colored pilots when other white personnel made disparaging comments, his respect for competence overcoming his inherited prejudices. By the war's end, Burke and Madison had developed a friendship that would last for decades, corresponding regularly and meeting occasionally at veteran reunions. Burke would often cite Madison's landing as evidence of what could be achieved when pilots truly understood their aircraft systems rather than just memorizing procedures. In Burke's view, Madison's survival proved that deep systems knowledge combined with creative thinking could overcome circumstances that would defeat purely procedural approaches. This philosophy influenced how Burke trained mechanics in his post-war career, emphasizing understanding over rote memorization, encouraging his trainees to think about why systems worked rather than just what they did. The technical details of how Madison controlled his aircraft, using only the trim wheel, eventually became a case study in aviation engineering courses. The trim system was designed to make small adjustments to control surface positions, fine-tuning the aircraft's flight characteristics during normal operations. Using it as a primary control meant operating it far outside its design parameters, which could have easily resulted in overcorrection, loss of control, or structural failure from overstressing the trim mechanism itself. That Madison successfully used this backup system not just to maintain controlled flight, but to execute combat maneuvers suggested both exceptional understanding of aircraft systems and extraordinary fine motor control under extreme stress. Flight simulators in later decades would sometimes include a scenario based on Madison's experience, challenging pilots to land an aircraft with jammed primary controls using only trim and throttle. The success rate was typically below 30%, even with pilots who knew in advance what they would face and had time to prepare mentally. Madison had managed it with no warning, while under combat stress after surviving a spiral that should have been unsurvivable, and while being pursued by enemy fighters who represented an immediate threat. The simulator results helped quantify just how exceptional his achievement had been, providing objective data about the difficulty of what he had accomplished. The psychological aspects of Madison's performance also attracted attention from military psychologists studying performance under extreme stress. The sequence of events, control failure, spiral, near-ground recovery, immediate engagement with enemy fighters, sustained flight in a crippled aircraft, and finally a landing that should have been impossible, would individually be considered high-stress situations that could degrade human performance. Experiencing all of them in sequence within 18 minutes should have overwhelmed anyone's ability to process information and make rational decisions. Yet Madison's decision-making remained remarkably sound throughout, with no evidence of panic, freezing, or the kind of cognitive narrowing that often accompanies extreme stress. When interviewed about this years later by researchers studying stress performance, Madison attributed his success to training that had emphasized staying ahead of the aircraft mentally, always thinking about what would happen next rather than fixating on current problems. During the spiral, even while fighting the controls with all his physical strength, part of his mind was already considering alternatives: the trim wheel, the possibility of bailout, the altitude required for various options, the potential consequences of each choice. This cognitive discipline, maintaining situational awareness and planning ahead even during crisis, proved decisive in allowing him to identify and execute the trim wheel solution before running out of altitude. It's worth noting what Madison didn't do during those critical minutes, as his non-actions were as important as his actions. He didn't panic, allowing fear to paralyze his thinking or drive him toward counterproductive responses. He didn't freeze, succumbing to the overwhelming nature of the situation and simply waiting for fate to determine the outcome. He didn't radio for help before attempting self-rescue, wasting precious seconds on communication that couldn't actually solve his immediate problem. He didn't abandon the aircraft prematurely, bailing out when there might still have been hope of recovery. Each of these non-actions represented a conscious choice to focus on productive problem-solving rather than emotional reaction. The capacity to make those choices repeatedly and correctly under conditions that should have precluded rational thought represented a form of courage that's less dramatic than the heroics celebrated in popular culture, but ultimately more important. The human capacity for adaptation under extreme pressure, demonstrated so clearly in Madison's experience, has implications far beyond military aviation. Emergency medicine, disaster response, deep-sea operations, space exploration, any field where people must perform complex tasks under life-threatening conditions can learn from how Madison transformed what should have been a fatal situation into a victory through creative problem-solving and refusal to accept conventional limitations. His experience provides a template for how training should prepare people not just for anticipated scenarios, but for the unexpected situations where standard responses prove inadequate. His story also illuminates the nature of expertise itself. True mastery of any complex system requires not just knowing how things should work, but understanding how they might fail and how to compensate when they do. Madison's conversations with Sergeant Burke about engine performance and control systems weren't just academic curiosity or mechanical interest. They were building mental models of his aircraft that proved life-saving when standard procedures became irrelevant. The depth of his systems knowledge allowed him to recognize that the trim wheel could theoretically provide control authority, while his practical skill and experience allowed him to execute that theory under impossible conditions. In the years following the war, Madison maintained close contact with several of his squadron mates, including Captain Hayes and Lieutenant Williams, who had escorted him home on that January day. Their reunions, which occurred annually for decades, would often involve retelling of the story, each pilot adding details that others had forgotten or never known. Hayes would describe the sick feeling in his stomach, watching Madison's aircraft spiral downward, certain he was about to witness his wingman's loss, followed by the disbelief when the aircraft somehow recovered. Williams would talk about the absolute shock when Madison's crippled aircraft attacked the German fighters, instead of running away, a decision that seemed suicidal, yet somehow succeeded. Madison himself would typically focus on the technical aspects, the precise movements of the trim wheel, the careful calculation of energy management during the dive, the feel of the aircraft responding sluggishly to his inputs. These different perspectives on the same event highlighted how complex and multifaceted any historical incident actually is. The official record captured basic facts: control failure, enemy engagement, aircraft damaged but pilot recovered safely. But the human experience, the terror, the determination, the split-second decisions, the physical sensations, the aftermath, required storytelling to preserve. Madison understood this, which is why he spent considerable time in his later years speaking to aviation groups, military historians, and engineering students, ensuring that the lessons from his experience wouldn't be lost to time or reduced to dry statistical summaries in official records. One lesson he particularly emphasized in these talks was about the relationship between rules and judgment. Military organizations, like most large institutions, rely heavily on standardized procedures to ensure consistency and reliability. These procedures are essential and save lives daily by providing proven responses to common emergency situations. But procedures are created for normal or anticipated abnormal situations, developed through experience and analysis of past incidents. When something truly unprecedented occurs, following the wrong procedure can be more dangerous than having no procedure at all. Madison's willingness to abandon standard doctrine and improvise, not recklessly, but based on sound understanding of physical principles and aircraft systems, made the difference between survival and loss. This balance between procedural discipline and adaptive creativity remains one of the fundamental challenges in any safety-critical field. Train people too rigidly, and they become helpless when facing unanticipated situations, unable to think beyond their checklists. Train them too loosely, and they may make dangerous improvisations when standard procedures would work fine, introducing unnecessary risk through overconfidence. Madison's experience suggested that the answer lay in deep systems understanding, combined with clear mental models of cause and effect, allowing practitioners to recognize when procedures apply and when they don't, when to follow the manual and when to close it and think from first principles. After the war, Madison used his GI Bill benefits to earn a degree in aeronautical engineering from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he wrote his thesis on aircraft control systems and failure modes. The thesis drew heavily on his January 17th experience, analyzing the mechanical failure that had jammed his control column and exploring design modifications that could prevent similar failures or provide better backup control authority. His work caught the attention of Boeing Aircraft Company, which offered him a position in their engineering division, despite the racial barriers that still limited opportunities for colored professionals in many industries. Madison spent 32 years working for Boeing, contributing to the design of commercial aircraft that incorporated redundant control systems specifically to prevent the kind of single-point failure that had nearly ended his life over France. His influence can be seen in the multiple independent control pathways that became standard in commercial aviation, where a single cable failure would never again leave a pilot with no options. Modern commercial aircraft have triple or quadruple redundancy in critical flight controls, a design philosophy that can be traced directly back to lessons learned from incidents like Madison's. Thousands of passengers who have flown safely despite control system failures owe their lives, in part, to a 19-year-old pilot who refused to accept that a jammed control stick meant certain loss. He also became a flight instructor, training hundreds of pilots over 3 decades at a civilian flight school he helped establish in Seattle. His teaching emphasized adaptability and creative problem-solving, the ability to recognize when conventional procedures wouldn't work, and to improvise solutions using whatever resources remained available. He would often tell his students about the day his control stick jammed, using the story not to glorify his own actions, but to illustrate principles about systems thinking, stress management, and the importance of understanding the why behind procedures rather than just memorizing the what. His students remembered him as demanding but fair, someone who expected excellence, but understood that learning required making mistakes. He had a gift for creating training scenarios that challenged students to think beyond their comfort zones while maintaining appropriate safety margins. Former students would later report that Madison's emphasis on understanding aircraft systems and thinking creatively about problems served them well throughout their flying careers, helping them navigate situations that might have defeated pilots trained in purely procedural approaches. The German pilot, Wilhelm König, survived the war despite the damage Madison inflicted on his aircraft that January day. He managed to nurse his Focke-Wulf back to his base, where mechanics counted 17 bullet strikes on the left wing and engine cowling, damage that easily could have been catastrophic, but had somehow left the aircraft flyable. König filed a report describing the American fighter's attack profile as suicidal and inexplicable, noting that the aircraft appeared to be barely under control, yet still managed to achieve a firing solution. He never flew combat again after that mission, having been reassigned to a training unit where he spent the remainder of the war teaching new pilots how to recognize and counter American fighter tactics. In 1978, 34 years after their brief and violent encounter, Madison and König met at an air show in Arizona. The meeting was arranged by a military historian who had been researching the engagement and had managed to identify both participants through archival records and extensive interviews. The two men, both in their 50s, both retired from aviation, spent 3 hours comparing their recollections of those 18 minutes over France, discovering both points of agreement and fascinating differences in their perspectives of the same events. König, speaking through an interpreter since Madison's German was limited to technical aviation terms, asked Madison the question that had puzzled him for more than 3 decades. Why did you attack when your aircraft was clearly disabled and you could have attempted to escape? Madison thought for a moment, then smiled with an expression that combined humor and hard-earned wisdom. Because, he said, I couldn't run away effectively with the limited control I had, so I figured I might as well run forward and at least make you worry about me instead of the bombers. Sometimes the best defense is an offense that nobody expects. König laughed at this answer, recognizing the truth in it. He admitted that Madison's attack had been so unexpected, so contrary to what any rational pilot should have done, that it had completely disrupted his own tactical thinking. Instead of executing a simple pursuit of a crippled aircraft, he had suddenly found himself reacting defensively to an attack that shouldn't have been possible. The psychological impact of facing an opponent who attacked despite being badly disadvantaged had been significant, making König question his own assessment of the situation and contributing to his decision to withdraw rather than press the engagement. The two former enemies parted as friends, exchanging addresses and promising to stay in touch. They corresponded occasionally over the following years, their letters discussing aviation history, comparing experiences, and gradually developing a friendship based on mutual respect for each other's skills and mutual recognition of the arbitrary nature of the conflict that had made them enemies. When König passed away in 1987, his family sent Madison a letter informing him of the passing and mentioning that König had often spoken of the young American pilot whose impossible attack had taught him to question his assumptions about what determined the outcome of combat encounters. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.